morning. So today I'm going to be talking to you about the plot diagram. The plot diagram just outlines the plot or the main storyline of a narrative. There are 5 elements of plot, and then plot is essentially driven by conflict, which also helps you determine your theme or central idea. So we have a lot of different pieces working together. Our goal is that by the end of this, you can identify the theme or central idea and the conflict of the story of an hour after tracking the events that took place in the story. So I'm going to be talking in the context of Romeo and Juliet as I explain this, because it's a text most people are familiar with or many of you have read last year. So the first element in the plot diagram is exposition. In the exposition, we get our main characters. The author establishes the setting, the time and place of the action, and gives any background information. So in Romeo and Juliet, if you think of the very first part where it says two families both alike in fair Verona, so we figure out that there are two families, the Capulets and the Montagues. They don't get along. There's been this long history of hatred, and that it takes place in Verona. We also get information about Romeo. He's a big romantic character. He loves this girl named Rosalind, and when you first read it, you're kind of confused because you're like, wait, I thought this was the story of him and Juliet. Exposition in Shakespeare's plays always takes place in Act 1, which is really interesting. His plot diagrams always follow the act. So Act 1 is always exposition, Act 2 is always rising action, Act 3 always has the climax, Act 4 always has falling action, and Act 5 the resolution, which is another reason Shakespeare's plays are so cool. Secondly, on the plot diagram, we have the rising action. So the rising action is a series of events that increases tension. It moves towards the climax, and it introduces the conflict, and the conflict generally increases as you work towards the climax. So in this case, Romeo decides with his cousin to go to the Capulet house for a ball, and he meets Juliet there. And that inciting incident, which is the incident that increases the tension and works towards the climax, is when they realize they are enemies. And that connects to our main conflict, which, in my opinion, is Romeo and Juliet versus society. So the man versus society conflict, and I'll talk about that more in a little bit. In Act 3, we're introduced to our climax, which is the event that is the major turning point for the plot. So during the rising action, Romeo and Juliet also decide they're going to get married, and they do so without anyone's knowledge, thinking that, maybe if they just get married, it'll solve some problems, their family won't be able to do anything, but a very amateur decision for two young people. And that is why the climax is so impactful. And the climax is when Tybalt kills Mercutio. And why is this the turning point? Because Romeo has to be banished, and Romeo and Juliet cannot be together. There is seemingly no way for them to physically or emotionally be together anymore because their families, this has now ended in murder. And that leads us to the falling action. The falling action is events that lead to the resolution. So the events are moving towards resolution, towards resolving, the tension or the conflict. However, sometimes the events go from bad to worse. And that's exactly what happens in Romeo and Juliet. So they realize they can't be together, so Friar Lawrence, who's supposed to be a smart adult in the play, isn't so smart and sets up a plan. So he tells Juliet she should pretend that she's going to marry Paris, the person her family members want her to marry. Of course, they're ignorant that she has already married Romeo. They get her a potion that basically will make her sleep, but appear that she is dead, and when Paris shows up to marry her, they will think she's dead, and then Romeo can arrive and they can run away together. However, word never gets to Romeo that this is the plan, and in the meantime, he buys a potion that could potentially kill himself. And when Romeo arrives, Juliet appears to be dead. He thinks she's dead, so he drinks poison, kills himself, and then she wakes up, thinks he's dead, and stabs herself. Talk about a tragedy. So that leads to our resolution. So that is the ending or final outcome for the characters. So the final outcome for Romeo and Juliet, unfortunately, are that they die. They end up killing themselves. And the conflict between the families is therefore resolved. So they feel like they are no longer going to be in conflict because it resulted in the death of one family member each. So the resolution, I always think that word resolution is interesting because it's not always positive. All right, and I'll be talking about conflict and how that leads to theme or central idea in the next slide.